to address this issue, speaking to the current event, as well as history, a biblical perspective, where this epidemic, as they're calling it, is tending, and how we can be prepared in these closing scenes of Earth's history. So before we begin, let's open up with a word of prayer. Father in heaven, we bow before you in the name of Jesus Christ. Thank you for this opportunity to hear from your word and what your word has to say regarding this pestilence. Bless us now and bless those who are hearing, that they will hear your voice. We thank you for what you will do, is our prayer. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen. Dr.
Amen.
Tim, welcome.
Yes, sir.
The floor
Thank
is
you.
yours.
Thank you. If we can go to this, the slide after the introduction. So it's Measles Mania in context. That's the introductory slide. And that's what we want to talk about today. We want to talk about the hysteria and the fear behind this latest outbreak of measles. And we want to put it in perspective. So to put everything in perspective, we need to turn to the Word of God. So let's go to slide number 2, where we have a picture of Josiah and the scribe Shaphan. So here we go. So the text reads, "And it came to pass, when the king had heard the words of the book of the law, that he rent his clothes." That's 2 Kings chapter 22, verse 11. 2 Kings chapter 22, verse 11. Now, this is an important passage. And if you were to look carefully at the picture, the artist does a fascinating thing. He shows King Josiah tearing his clothes after hearing the book of the law. Many scholars believe it is the book of Deuteronomy. Could have been any of the first 5 books, but most likely that one. And if you look carefully in the picture there, you can see the people are worshiping idols. There's a calf and everything like that. What is so powerful about it is that I don't think that Josiah and Hilkiah, the high priest, and Shaphan had no memory of what God required. I believe that they did. But it wasn't until that they were handed the book of the law and they looked at the history of where their people came from, when they looked at how God had led them, when they looked at the impending curses, that it was too much for him to take, that he tore his clothes. He saw what God intended for them. He saw how he had dealt with them with history, and to see how far they had went down away from God, how they had followed the path of compromise until they were not even recognizable, broke his heart and caused him to tear his robes. The reason why we bring this up is that sometimes we need to have a little historical perspective on where we came from so that we understand the position that we're in today. Measles did not develop out of thin air. It didn't just happen in 2019. It has been going on for quite some time. And so to have a healthy perspective about this, we need to look at the past. But first of all, let's go to the next slide. And here is the order of the Commissioner of New York. This is a medical order issued by Dr. Barbeau. And he basically, summarizing here, he talks about this measles outbreak of 250 people, confirmed cases of measles in these different zip codes in the city of New York. And he's saying that everyone needs to have the vaccine. Otherwise, they will be fined $1,000 per person. And they will, and I'm not even sure how they'll enforce it, because to enforce this would require some very intrusive police work and testing of people and looking at vaccine certificates. But it's such a crisis that he's willing to suspend all civil liberty, all health laws, all individuality, anyone, so that they can avert this measles crisis after 250 cases, documented cases, have appeared in New York. Now, this sounds terrible. Most people hearing this, they go, well, I don't want my kid to have measles. I don't want to have measles. This sounds crazy, right? It must be very serious if the government, over 250 cases, is willing to suspend all liberty. Let's go to the next slide. Unfortunately, though, history is not our friend, at least not in this one, or not their friend, should I say. This is actually from the journal Pediatrics. This is a pro-vaccine journal. And if you notice here, they're talking about a case in 2011 where 725 people were confirmed having measles. 725 people were confirmed to have measles. What was even shocking about this is that of the 725, 102 of them had 2 doses of the measles vaccine. So think about it. New York is willing to suspend all the laws protecting individual rights, individual conscience, and yet in Canada and Quebec, they had 725 cases, 102 of them had at least 2 doses of measles, and in most of this population had at least 1 dose of the measles vaccine. And there was no talk of suspending freedom. There was no talk of forcing anyone. Why? Because the vaccine had actually failed. The vaccine had actually failed to protect people from the dreaded disease of measles. Now, here's the better question. How many people died in this terrible outbreak of 725 confirmed cases of measles? 0. 0 people died. 0 people died. Now, you think about that. We're willing in New York to suspend all freedom. We're willing to throw everything out. Over 250 confirmed cases, no deaths. And that yet in Quebec, where they had a high incident or a high rate of vaccination, there was no such talk. You see, when you begin to look back in history, you begin to see a perspective here that something is amiss. But we're going to go back even further. I want to go back even further in the history of the United States, and I want you to see how measles was dealt with. Let's go to the next slide. So this is the pictures of Dr. Russell Trawl, and this is from the Hydropathic Encyclopedia. And you can see this is dated 1854. All right, now this is fascinating because this is what he says, and you can go where the red arrow is, and I'll read. He goes, I apprehend that these sequelae, that means the terrible symptoms of the measles virus, he says, I apprehend that these sequelae are to be attributed in the main to the drugging by which one poison is attempted to be got out of the body by the introduction of a dozen others. It is certain that measles has been extensively treated in many different places in the water cure way, and I have never known nor heard of a single death, nor of one of these resultant diseases. Now think about that. He's saying that in 1854, with measles, they were treating it successfully using hydrotherapy, and that he attributes most of the deaths to the drugging. Now you think about it, what were they doing there? Well, in addition to bloodletting, they were giving mercury, they were giving strychnine, which is what we call rat poison today. They were doing all sorts of things, giving laudanum. They were giving all these drugs, and it was making people sick, and they were dying. Anytime we want to talk about the death rates from disease in the past, we must always put a little asterisk next to it and remember how people were being treated, how they were actually administering therapy, because often the therapy was the cause of the death, and very little times was it the disease. And all you got to do is just look at medical history. So again, just our takeaway from this, Dr. Trawl is successfully treating measles in 1854 with water. All right? But let's move on. Let's go to the next slide. This is John Harvey Kellogg. This is from his publication, Good Health, in Battle Creek, Michigan, where his sanitarium was, February 1883. All right? We're just going to read what he says, and there's a lot to this. He says this: when an epidemic of measles is prevailing, great care should be taken to prevent exposure to the disease. This cannot always be done, as the popular dread of disease is not sufficiently great to introduce the entire isolation of persons who are suffering with it. Now, wait. Let's stop right there. This is fascinating. This is in 1853, well before a vaccine is even thought of or invented, all right? You're going to see the word inoculation, and I'll explain that. But there's no vaccine for this. And he just said that this is an epidemic of measles. That means people are getting it all the time. But he says that isolation doesn't work. Why? Because the popular dread of disease is not sufficiently great to induce the entire isolation of persons suffering with it. Wait a second. If measles is this terrible disease, just murdering people by the thousands, by the hundreds of thousands, why then couldn't you convince people to stay indoors, to stay out of public places with measles? You got to ask yourself that. In 1883, was it that they didn't know about disease? No, when people had smallpox, people stayed indoors. They knew about quarantine, even then. But notice they weren't scared of measles. Yet 250 cases, 0 deaths, and we're about to throw out all civil and individual liberties, even religious freedom where people want to follow their conscience. Makes no sense. As a matter of fact, in New York, there's a group of Jews, Sabbath keepers, Hasidic Jews, who actually believe that the Bible has a prescription. And when I say Bible, I mean the Old Testament, the Torah, the Navi'im and Ketuvim, the law, the writings, and the prophets. They actually believe that the principles contained in the Old Testament are sufficient for them to live by, and that God who designed the body will help prevent disease. That's what they believe, so they don't get vaccinated. They were actually being discriminated against. Sabbath-keeping Jews were being discriminated against by the governor, by the people of New York, because they wouldn't take a vaccine. You think about it. Let that sink into your mind a little bit, that there are Sabbath keepers who believe in the Word of God and believe that God can help them, and therefore they don't get the vaccine, which isn't killing they don't get the vaccine to a virus that's not killing anyone, and yet their rights don't mean anything? Very interesting. But let's move on. So the next part, he says, various experiments have been made which seem to indicate that the degree of protection may be afforded by inoculation with a virus of the disease, as was practiced as a means of protection from smallpox before the discovery of vaccination. So just so you know that inoculation and vaccination are not the same. A vaccination is where you take the disease and you inject it into an animal, and then you take the matter from the animal and inject it back into a human. The idea being that the disease is somehow transformed into a more milder form when you take it from the animal and inject it into the human, all right? Inoculation is where another human being has the disease and you take pus or scrapings from them, and then you put it under your skin or put it in your nose, and so you take someone else's disease from another human being, give it to you or someone who is not sick, and that's how it prevents. So he says that some people think that that will work for measles. That's what he says. But inoculation is not even practiced. Notice what he says at the very end, last paragraph. In mild cases, very little treatment is required except such as necessary to make the patient comfortable. Good nursing is much more important than medical treatment. In other words, when he says that, he's referring to hydrotherapy, making sure people get plenty of water, getting wrapped up in blankets, getting a simple food so they can restore their strength. This is what he's talking about. He says in mild cases, you don't have to do anything except for to make someone comfortable. In 1883, this is what John Harvey Kellogg is saying. Fascinating to think about that. When we think that everyone was just dying from these diseases, he's saying people weren't even afraid of it, that they would stay indoors. Let's go to the next slide. This person here may not be familiar to the audience, but this is Dr. Simon Baruch. Simon Baruch was a Jew who immigrated to the United States, and he became a surgeon. He was very intelligent, and the people that he worked for said, hey, you need to go to medical school. He did. And he distinguished himself so much that they had him serve in the Confederate Army as the chief surgeon. And he served for many years. And even though he served with the Confederates, his reputation as a medical provider was so great that there was no animosity with him going to New York later on and establishing medical institutions. He is known famously, and it still exists today in New York, they have bathhouses that bear his name because he believed that sanitation was so bad in New York that people actually needed to take frequent baths and become clean. He actually believed that that was going to help prevent disease. Now, mind you, Dr. Baruch also believed in vaccines. He doesn't believe in the smallpox vaccine at this time. But in his guide, Principles and Practices of Hydrotherapy, he talks about the application of water disease. He actually says, and let's just read his own words, but he actually believes that hydrotherapy was more than sufficient. So let's start here where it says measles. Now notice what he says. I want you to hear his own words. measles, although the disease usually runs an uneventful course, wait a second, we have 250 people documented with measles virus in New York, and we are losing our minds wanting to take away all freedom. And this man, in 1899, this is when the book was written, 1899, he says, although this disease usually runs an uneventful course, that means it doesn't do anything. Many cases are encountered by the general practitioner which cause him anxiety and which are the source of distress and danger to the patient. Especially difficult does the management of this affection become when, during the latter part of its course, pulmonary complications ensue. So he admits that things can happen, and for this reason, they're brought to a general practitioner. But by and large, it doesn't really hurt anyone. And so he goes through and he talks about specifically how you can treat measles with hydrotherapy and how people get well. In the middle of talking about this, he lists a number of practitioners who do it. So this is one, and I could have listed a bunch, but to keep it brief, he says in America, Dr. Hiram Corson, an aged country practitioner whose practical writings exercised great influence on my own 25 years ago, says, in 60 years with thousands of children under my care with measles, I have never lost one with that disease. It's amazing. Think about it. I have never lost one with that disease. And what did he do? I scarcely ever did anything in measles except to give a laxative. That would have been what's the word I'm looking for? It would have been not a suppository, an enema. It would have been a water enema to give a laxative and then keep the patient cool. I often sponged the whole body with cold water and gave it copiously as a cooling remedy. So think about it. This dreaded disease, in 60 years, with thousands of children, he didn't lose one. And what did he do? He got the bowels moving, made the patient drink a lot of water, and kept the body cool. In other words, he let the immune system do what it was designed to do, and people got better. And then notice he says right after, here's his comment. The above cited clinical data cannot fail to convince any reasonable reader of the value of hydrotherapy in measles. Again, 1899, he's writing this. Conclusions. As in other diseases, the author has cited support of his own advocacy of hydrotherapy in measles, the view of well-known practitioners and teachers whose testimony is unbiased, clear, and unimpeachable. 1899, we're told that vaccines saved us from these diseases. We're told that you've got to get the vaccine, otherwise you're going to be fined $1,000 or more. And this guy was treating it with simple water. And I know I'm going to belabor this point, but it needs to be belabored. Let's go to the next slide. Here's another nice one. This is, if you look carefully, this is George Knapp Abbott, medical doctor. And he is the dean of the faculty, professor of hydrotherapy and practice of medicine in the College of Medical Evangelists in Loma Linda, California, or as we would know today, Loma Linda University. Now, I would love to talk to someone from Loma Linda University and ask them if they would stand by Dr. Knapp, who used to teach there, who says, let's go ahead and read what he says. Measles is an acute contagious febrile disease characterized by blotchy exanthem and accompanied by coryza, which is cold symptoms. Notice what he says, where the red arrow is. It is usually uneventful in its course and not accompanied by any great mortality. This is 1911. And he's saying it's not accompanied by any great mortality. He doesn't deny that it's contagious. He doesn't deny that people get fevers. He doesn't deny anything, but he says it's not even accompanied by great mortality. And notice what he says, and there's no vaccine at this time. There's no talk of vaccine. There's no nothing. He says, however, the patient may be made more comfortable during the febrile period and the vital resistance so sustained that there lies less tendency to bronchopneumonia. Now think about it. The major concern isn't saving someone like from Ebola, where you're hemorrhaging from the eyes and hemorrhaging from the nose and hemorrhaging between the underarms, and your skin is bleeding and you're dying and your body's going to hypovolemic shock. That's Ebola. That's serious. This is not Ebola. And notice he says you need to make someone comfortable. and help them not to have bronchopneumonia. And so what do? He says, the eruption does not appear till the 4th day, so a treatment must be begun before positive diagnosis can be made. He says, and what's the treatment? Hydrotherapy. Hydrotherapy. Using cooling, sponging, all these things with hydrotherapy on this disease. And guess what? Few people died. Few people died. No vaccine at this time. Dr. Knapp Abbott was a proficient physician and had respect of not only his peers at the College of Medical Evangelists, but also in the world. Let's go to the next slide. Next slide. This is from Guy Hinsdale. All right. Now this is his book on hydrotherapy, and this is published in 1910. Now, what's fascinating about this gentleman, Dr. Hinsdale, is he was also a member of the American Medical Association. So this is the AMA, which is probably the greatest physician advocacy group for pharmaceuticals in the nation today. There's not a drug that the AMA doesn't like. They like all drugs until the drug has been shown to be absolutely the most devastating to the human body. And then maybe they'll say, hey, it wasn't such a good idea. But their bias is towards drugs. And so Guy Hinsdale, even in the time that he's writing, the AMA is still biased in favor of drugs. Notice what he says. He talks about how to treat this. And I just go where the red arrow begins. Rubbing down with a fine linen cloth wrung out of quite cold water responds to the indications in measles. The delayed eruption frequently appears at once after this procedure, and the threatening symptoms vanish. Wait a second. Rubbing down with fine linen cloth wrung out of quite cold water. That's all you have to do for measles. That's it. And this again, here's a guy who was a member of the American Medical Association, who was quite famous, and he sees measles as something that can be treated with a rub down of a cold water sponge. We have to keep things in perspective. But again, let's move on. Let's move on because things change. So we're going to get closer to the modern era. Now this is Life magazine. Here we are, the next slide, Life magazine. And the title is, With New Vaccines, No More Measles. They were so positive about what they were going to do. They were so confident that they were going to eliminate measles all the way back in 1961. Now, what's fascinating is the vaccine had not been used at this time. So people were not getting the picture of the young girl getting the shot is either getting an experimental dose or she's getting regular smallpox vaccine. So here she is getting a vaccine, and it's for measles, okay? Now, I want you to go to the caption towards the bottom with the red arrow. And notice what it says here, all right? This is Life magazine. This is not an anti-vaccine or natural health journal. This is a secular publication that trends towards organized medicine and the pharmaceutical companies. Notice what it says, red arrow. Measles is so universal that parents, especially American parents, tend to look upon it casually. That means it's not serious. And he says, it's not, most people don't even think it's serious. And then, but notice they have to try to convince Americans that they need the vaccine. So notice the next sentence, but is a serious illness that can have drastic complications, such as brain-damaging encephalitis and fatal pneumonia. In the U.S. last year, measles killed 410 children, 150 more than polio. In underdeveloped areas of Africa, Asia, and Latin America, measles is a dreaded scourge. In India alone, in the year 1959, over 80,000 children died from the disease. That's terrible, right? But why is it that the disease isn't rapidly wiping out the population of children? The population of children in the United States. Only 410 died. Now, look, if your child was one of the 410, that's awful, right? It's absolutely awful. But again, we have to keep things in perspective. We have to keep things in perspective about the seriousness of the actual measles. This is the next slide is actually the title to the article. This is another article in Life. It's another article in Life, and this is the Health Secretary Hugh Celebrez. And they're getting excited in April 1963 about the development of the measles vaccine. So in 1961, Life magazine was announcing it. They were getting excited. They thought they could end it. And again, it wasn't a disease that anyone feared. It wasn't a disease that anyone was asking relief for because it wasn't a big deal. But now the drug companies have developed something, and so now they got to do it. Now, again, they're still telling you that about 400 people die every year in the United States from it. And notice the title right under the picture. It says, "Goodbye to Measles." Just the line just above it says, "At last, an underrated killer gets the needle." Again, they're touting 400. Now, 400 deaths from measles. Just keep that in the back of your mind. Life magazine, April 19th, 1963, continued. So they're showing you, this is the next slide. So now you should see a guy working on developing a virus in 2 children. Now this is interesting because they're telling you about this terrible disease and how they're working for a vaccine and all this other stuff. Now I want you to pay close attention to the picture here. There's a boy with chicken pox and a girl with mumps. You can, if you look carefully at her face, you can see that her parotid gland is enlarged, which is where mumps usually is. So the parotid gland is on the side. It looks like your cheek is inflamed, so to speak. Now look at this. Here are these 2 children. Notice what it says where the red arrow is. Wearing facefuls of their afflictions, Michael Iger, 4, and Vicky Freeman, 3, both of New York, show full-blown cases of chickenpox above and mumps to the right. The viruses of both ailments have been isolated, but Mike and Vicky's involuntary demonstrators of Mike and Vicky are involuntary demonstrators of the child's own method of self-immunization, catching the actual disease. Now notice this. Keep this in mind. In 1963, a child has chickenpox and another one has mumps, and it's just kind of laughed at. Look, they're getting the disease and they're going to be immunized from having the disease. No death, no worries, no nothing. And yet today, if you don't get your MMR, measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine, New York is about to shut things down. Think about that for a moment. Children can't go to school and people can't even have jobs unless they get vaccines for chickenpox and mumps. And here is Life magazine in 1963, kind of tongue-in-cheek, laughing about it. Look at these kids. Yeah, we've isolated the viruses, but we have no vaccine, so the kids will be all right. They don't have to worry about it. And it's true, they didn't have to worry about it. What a difference. What a difference just a few decades makes, where we're freaking out today, almost declaring what would be similar to martial law, suspending individual liberty, just suspending religious liberty over 250 cases, and here are kids with a disease, and they show a picture of it, and it's cute. It's cute. We go on to the next slide. And so in this article, they're going to talk about the different diseases that they're wanting to make vaccines for, right? They're wanting to make vaccines for, and so you can see the man-size speed stick, the guy putting on the super deodorant. I left the advertisement in there so you could see this is how they did it back in the day. Life magazine. So it's still Life magazine, April 19, 1963. And notice what it says here about mumps. So I enlarged the section on mumps. It says this: mumps attacking over 90% of all children. That sounds terrible. 90% of all children. It sounds terrible that 90% of all children in the United States would get it. It says this virus is usually so benign that half of its victims are unaware that they have it. The disease is so bad that half the people who get it don't even know that they have it. Again, the MMR is the vaccine that we're giving, and people are freaking out if you don't get it. And back in the day in 1963, if you got the mumps virus, half of the children would get it and not even know that they had it. Crazy. But he goes on, but it can cause pancreatitis, encephalitis in children, and severe inflammation of the testicles in adult men. As a possible preventative, shots of a special gamma globulin can be taken by men who lack prior immunity and have been exposed. A killed virus vaccine gives no more than 2 years immunity. We don't say that anymore. Notice this. They're talking about it. It doesn't exist yet. That vaccine. They haven't done it. And so what he's saying is, hey, don't worry about it. Worst thing, you can get this gamma globulin which will boost your immune system. And they said, don't worry about it. Even though we're trying to work on a vaccine, it says a killed virus vaccine gives no more than 2 years immunity. Think about that. They're telling on themselves. They're literally telling on themselves that the vaccine, at best, will give you 2 years of immunity. And then he goes on, live virus vaccines promising more durable immunity will soon be tried on human beings. So we should hold our breath, cross our fingers for these new vaccines coming out with a disease that 90% of the children get, allegedly. I'm just going by their statistics. 90% of them get, and half of them don't even know that they have it. We need to be with bated breath, waiting for this vaccine to save us that nobody dies from. Interesting. But we go on. Life magazine again, April 19th, 1963. So notice you're going to talk about German measles and chickenpox. We'll start first with German measles. It says, first thing, milder than ordinary measles. So let's think about that. In 1853, Russell Trowell mentioned that the treatment for measles was more lethal than measles. Harvey Kellogg mentioned later on in 1883, he said that measles didn't, even though it was very contagious, people didn't even fear it, and you could never convince them to stay indoors because it was completely non-lethal. We read with George Abbott later on in 1911 saying that, hey, most people get it, it's no big deal, you just need to make them comfortable. I mean, seriously, this was more mild than the disease, which was already considered mild as early as 1911 and 1889? Really? It's interesting. Goes on. German measles can cause birth defects, can cause the birth of a defective baby if mothers contract it during the first 3 months of their pregnancy. The virus was isolated last year, giving promise that a vaccine will be developed. Notice, now here's the kicker. Here's the kicker. Now, I just want you to know, the German measles is called rubella. So we've talked about measles, we've talked about mumps, and now we're going to talk about rubella. So this is the German measles rubella. Last part of this box, last sentence. Notice what it says. The best procedure for immunization, drum roll, now is to expose little girls deliberately to German measles, provided their mothers aren't pregnant. I mean, seriously. We must be living in the Twilight Zone. This was common knowledge. This is what people thought. Oh my gosh, Becky down the road has rubella. Let's go send our daughter Jennifer to her house and they can have a sleepover so that everyone can get measles and the neighborhood will be protected.
Not today.
Today? Not today. Today, it's time to send a SWAT team to your house. It's time to call in the troops. It's time to declare a national emergency. What has happened to us? This is why do you see, we're going over just a small part. You can see why Josiah, looking at his people and where they have gone from where they were supposed to be, would tear his robes. It's insanity, utter insanity. I just want to read the next one on chickenpox, all right? I remember, I'm old enough to remember what it was like to have chickenpox. I survived. I'm still here. It says this, chickenpox, also known as varicella, its fever, blistery pimples, and itchy scabs produce no complications in the majority of children. This is something we give a vaccine for. And notice what they're saying. This was conventional wisdom in 1963, and I assure you nothing changed before the invention of the vaccine. 99% of whom get it, no complications, no big deal. It says in adults, it can be complicated by pneumonia. That means someone who already has a compromised immune system, and encephalitis. The virus can lie dormant in the child's body after his symptoms disappear and pop out many years later as the more serious disease of shingles. Chickenpox virus was isolated 10 years ago, but no vaccine has been perfected. I mean, think about it. Today, not only do we give a vaccine for chickenpox, but we also have to give one for shingles. Now, it is true we don't see outbreaks of chickenpox, but this disease also wasn't very serious. What did we save ourselves from? I'm not sure. Not sure. Let's go on to the next one. Next slide. This is now the vaccine has come out, and this is an advertisement. Life, February 5th, 1965, the measles vaccine has come out. And so now there's an ad campaign to convince the public that they need this vaccine. Here's a virus that was not serious. They need this. They need this, okay? They got to have it. They need it. So notice what it says here. And we're going to go to the next slide because I blow it up so we can actually see it. I blow it up. Now, I want you to know this. I want you to hear the statistics because everyone's big on statistics. Notice what it says. This is a Merck, Sharp, and Dome advertisement. This is the pharmaceutical manufacturer of the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine, okay? This is them. This is their own words. I'm not putting any words. This is what they're saying. Start a first paragraph. For most children, measles is certainly distressing and inconvenient. Now, wait. For most children, certainly distressing and inconvenient. That's right. It is not serious. But for some, it can be serious and even tragic. In fact, 1 in every 6 who gets measles develops secondary bacterial infection, such as pneumonia or ear infection. That's still not a life-threatening thing. Still not a life-threatening thing. About 1 in 1,000, about 1 case in 1,000 measles causes inflammation of the brain, encephalitis, and infection for which there's no specific treatment. Now, this is an interesting point right here. Because sometimes when people get viral meningitis, they're correct. There is no specific treatment. What you do is you maintain the person, you hydrate them, reduce the fever, and guess what happens? They're okay afterwards. Very interesting. They're okay. Notice they have to be very careful with their language. And some of these children, because most of them get better, so out of 1 in 1,000 gets encephalitis. So we're dealing 1 in 1,000. And then out of that 1 in 1,000, even a smaller percentage of these children causes only temporary changes. In others, there's permanent damage such as mental retardation. And in some do not survive. So we're talking less than 1 in 1,000 may actually die from measles. Less than 1 in 1,000. Not 1 in 1,000, less than 1 in 1,000. In 1962, for example, 408 children in the United States died from measles. And then it mentions polio. Now, I put this statistic on there. I went and looked it up. The population of the United States in 1965 was 192 million people. 192 million people. Now, let's just say that 10% of the population was children. It probably was more, 10%. That is 19.2 million children. 408 of them die. That's still terrible, but that is not a life-threatening epidemic. In 1965, not even a life-threatening epidemic. Not in 1962, not in 1963, not even life-threatening. Notice what this advertisement is for. It is to convince you that you need the measles vaccine. You need the measles vaccine, and yet it is not life-threatening. They have to admit it legally. But the rollout continues. The rollout continues. We're going to change slides, and we're going to jump across the pond of the Atlantic, and we're going to look at the UK. This is an article I referenced last time. This is from the Proceedings of the Royal Academy of Medicine. And this is D.L. Miller, and he believes in the vaccine. Don't think for a moment he likes vaccines. There isn't a vaccine that he doesn't believe in. But I want you to look at this. And the reason why he writes this article is because they're recognizing that it's going to be tough to convince people that they need the measles vaccine. They know that it's coming out. It's 1964. It's about to roll out in 1965. And the drug manufacturers and the medical associations are rubbing their hands together thinking, we got this new drug, we're going to use it. So notice, if you look at the graph carefully, okay? Because sometimes when you look at graphs on the history of measles, they show that the vaccine saved us. The graph starts, and it's tough to see if you look all the way, it starts in 1946. And you see measles in the dark line, and you see it's spiked pretty high. So you see it rough at the 70 mark. So 70 million, maybe, people have got it. And as you keep working your way down, right? Keep working, and these are deaths, okay? Or sorry, rate per million. Oh my gosh, it's even worse than that. I need to read these graphs. So we're looking at 70 out of 1 million children die. 70 out of 1 million. Now, if I remember correctly, they used to say that autism was 1 in 10,000. In 1946, in the United Kingdom, they were having 60 deaths per 1 million. And autism at one time was 1 in 10,000, and now in some areas it is 1 in 46 or 1 in 66. And we made a vaccine that people didn't even need, hardly anyone was dying for, and there has been a huge controversy over whether or not this vaccine or others vaccines have been associated with autism. And we're freaking out about a disease which hardly killed anyone when there was no vaccine for, wasn't even considered lethal virus. And we have an epidemic where children have lifelong brain damage and can't even live on their own. We have to keep things in perspective. If there should be any emergency declaration, the government should say, hey, we're gonna halt everything until we get our heads wrapped around this autism epidemic. But no. Those questions and investigations lead to areas that are uncomfortable. So we're going to continue to talk about measles. So let's get back to the graph. If you go all the way down, you look all the way to 1962, it looks like it is under 10 deaths per 1 million people. In 1962. This is before a vaccine even came out. And then notice what he says here, okay? So this is from his own statistics. This is what he says. In the time span between 1905 and 1909, there was a total of 9,301 deaths from measles. He says in 1963, there were a total of 132. This is before the vaccine. There was only 132, and the population of the United Kingdom in 1963 was 53 million. This is less than 1,000th of the population. And notice what, and if you look carefully, and this is from the article itself, all right? I'm taking this from the article itself. It says this, if you look here, towards the bottom, more than 1/2 of those deaths occurred in children who had, this is quote, chronic disease or disability, mainly congenital defects. And of the 66 remaining patients, 14 had a recent acute illness or were stated to be unduly susceptible to the infection. That means they were probably living in squalid, terrible conditions. We're losing, today we've lost our minds where we're wanting to take away freedom over disease. Before the vaccine in United Kingdom was killing 132 children. More than half of them already had compromised immune systems and problems. This is why we need to keep things in perspective. This is why we have to look to the past. Let's go on to the next slide. Next slide here. So, and this is him quoting. This is the same article, D.L. Miller, and I just wanted to read these two things. So he believes in vaccination. He's trying to sell it. So we're going to start with the green arrow, okay? We're going to start with the green arrow. He's trying to sell this to a population who he knows is skeptical. Again, it only killed 132 people in 1963. That's sad. I don't want any child to die. But we have to keep things in perspective. There are more children who die today of being hit by cars, drowning. I mean, listen, the most dangerous thing in the state of Florida for children is not a gun, it's not the measles virus, it's not a car, it is a swimming pool. More children die in Florida from drowning than they ever will from measles. Just that's the fact. And I don't see parents freaking out and concreting in their pools. If we wanted, I mean, could you imagine? The cement truck goes around house to house, says, sir, we're going to have to concrete in your pool. There was 1,000 deaths of children drowning. You're like, yeah, but I keep my pool clean. I have a cage around it. They're like, sorry, we're going to concrete in your pool. We're just going to concrete it in. Nobody can swim in your pool. You're like, yes, but it doesn't make sense. You're like, no, we have to protect everyone. Don't you want to save a child's life? And we're talking thousands. We're not talking hundreds, we're talking thousands. But anyways, let's read the green arrow. The incidence of serious complications of measles is not high. Right. That's what he says. Here's a guy who's trying to sell you on the vaccine, and he candidly admits the incidence of serious complications of measles is not high. It may vary in different epidemics and be reduced by the use of antibiotics. But because of its universality of measles, the total number of complications and admission to hospitals is large enough to be important. Now, again, it's small, but it's large enough to be important. The proportion of serious complications that lead to permanent disability can at present only be guessed. But even if small, the total number of children so affected may be considerable. They don't even know. He just basically said, we don't even know. We don't even know. It's so rare, we don't even know. But it might be more sizable. And notice his final justification for why you need the measles vaccine. Measles is, moreover, an unpleasant disease that imposes much discomfort on nearly every child and a burden of anxiety and work on parents and doctors. Now, wait a second. Now, I want you to understand this. This vaccine that he's talking about later on, after years in 1986, is protected by the federal government from lawsuits because children would have anaphylactic reactions, they would have brain swelling, they would even get measles itself, they would get all these problems, and so the government reimburses people for this. A vaccine which was justified because it reduces the anxiety and workload on parents and doctors?
And discomfort.
Would anyone want to, seriously, would anyone want to trade autism, anaphylactic shock, autoimmune disease, acute disseminated encephalomyelitis for a little anxiety and discomfort? Really? How is it that parents today are considered terrible parents if they're willing to nurse their children to health when they have measles versus a parent who gets a vaccine to eliminate a little discomfort, anxiety, and work? This is how he's justifying it. Let's read the blue arrow. These are facts which, among others, will have to be considered in the assessment of the need of universal measles vaccination. Now notice, this line he had to put in because he has to be honest. He has to be honest. And he still believes that we need the measles vaccine, but notice what he says. It is probable that most, if not all, the improvement to be expected in this country from raised standards of nutrition and hygiene, abolition of overcrowding, and the higher standards of medical care and treatment has already been achieved. So wait a second, the 132 deaths that they have from measles in 1963, which he mentioned, is due to what? Nutrition, hygiene, the abolition of overcrowding, and higher standards of medical care. Why in the world are we freaking out today? Why in the world are we losing our minds? Well, there's a good reason for it. And it has much to do with the industry and politicians who crave, above all things, power. And this is where we have to be careful. Notice he eventually says further advance is likely to come only from prevention of disease by immunization. And on the available evidence, this would seem to be well worth doing. That's his best argument. It might be a good idea because it's going to reduce anxiety and work on parents and doctors. That's what he thinks. That should be the death knell to the measles argument. Unfortunately, it is not. And so because it's not, we're going to move on, and we're going to look at another advertisement. Let's go to the next slide. This is an Ebony magazine. All right, this is an advertisement in Ebony magazine. So because Ebony magazine is a secular publication for black people, they have black people in there, and they're trying to convince them that they need the measles vaccine. So you have a very culturally appropriate measles. And notice this. I want you to notice this. Notice what they're saying here. I never realized my kids might need a second measles vaccination. Now, wait a second. D.L. Miller and everyone else was saying, we're going to end measles. We're going to knock it down. We're going to take it out. That'll be the end of it. We're going to take care of it. They never said anything that you would need 2 doses. What happened to the success that we were going to have with the vaccine? Now you need 2 doses? This is in 1992, Ebony magazine. Let's go to the next slide. Now, on the next page of this advertisement in the magazine in October 1992, and you can see the little picture and everything, the drug company is going to tell you some things. And I want you to look at this. In 1992, what they were saying, because the drug company is telling on itself. And they have to. They're legally required to do this. This is probably one of the reasons why you don't see too many advertisements for vaccines, because if they advertise this way today, they would have to tell you about the known drug reactions, and they would get sued, because if they didn't put them in there, they could really get hurt. So notice this. Notice what it says here. Important information about measles vaccine. Always consult your doctor about vaccinations. Some persons should not receive measles vaccines. This is the drug company. This is not me. This is not anyone else. This is the drug company. 1, pregnant females. What's interesting is that today people say, well, pregnant women should get the measles. In 1992, the company Merck said, no, they shouldn't. Anyone who is sick with something more serious than a minor illness, such as a common cold, well, why would that be a problem if the vaccine was like taking a vitamin? Because it's not, and it can ruin you. Anyone with a fever or febrile illness, don't get the vaccine. Anyone who had an allergic reaction to eating eggs, serious enough to require medical attention. Anyone who had an allergic reaction to antibiotic called neomycin, serious enough to require medical treatment. Anyone with cancer, leukemia, or lymphoma. Anyone with a disease that lowers the body's resistance to infection. Amazing what they're telling you. Anyone taking a drug that lowers the body's resistance to infection, such as an anti-cancer drugs or steroids, cortisone, or prednisone. They're telling you, don't get the vaccine. This is Merck. Now, look where the red line is. In addition, there are special considerations for those with personal or family history of convulsions. Stop right there. Do you know how many parents whose first child has a convulsion or reaction, they say, please, I don't want to give my kids any vaccines. And what does the state of California do? Too bad. What is the state of New York saying? Too bad. And here's Merck telling you in 1992, don't do it. And notice what they said. The risk of convulsion following vaccination is very low. They're telling you that exists. Now, what is convulsions? Seizures. That means you're having an attack on your brain. Neurological disease. That's what they're telling you. They're not saying autism, they're saying neurological disease, but they're admitting this in 1992. And it says, children with a personal history of convulsions or a family history of convulsions may receive the vaccine. However, you should tell the person who is to give the vaccine about such a history and discuss whether vaccination is appropriate. In other words, there's a risk there, and they know this. They know this. Now let's go to the second red line. And you get to see the nice logo of Merck on the other side of that red line. It says this, notice this right here. Vaccination may not result in protection against measles in every child. Now wait a second. The city of New York, with its health czar and its mayor, are forcing people to get a vaccine that Merck admits in 1992 that they have to put legally in their advertisement. By the way, vaccination may not result in protection against measles in every child. Yes. You know why they have to say that? Let's look at the next slide.
Dr. Tim.
Look at the next. Yes, sir.
Hold 1 second. Safe
Yes.
to Serve International. If you're online and you're watching this presentation right now, I'm going to kindly ask you to reach out to family members, friends who are now living in New York City and have them to just join and watch this presentation. It's of utmost importance. And I believe that what has begun in New York City will spread to various states and countries. Please, Doc.
Thank you. And you know, we need to keep those people in our prayers, and we need to try to be a voice for them whenever we can. So I appreciate the opportunity to share this information. I think it's important, and I think it keeps things in perspective. So as we're on this next slide, and it says the Journal of Infectious Diseases, the red subtitle, major article, all right? Now, I want you to see this. Measles outbreak among previously immunized healthcare workers in the Netherlands. Now, remember the advertisement we just read from Merck in 1992 saying that not everyone who gets the vaccine will be protected from measles. No doubt. No doubt. Notice what it says here. Now, this is a quote from them, or this is a quote from the article. During March, April of 2014, an outbreak of measles affecting twice vaccinated HCW healthcare workers occurred in a hospital in the Western Netherlands, Hospital X, subsequent to the admission of 2 patients with measles in week 12 of 2014. Now think about that. These were people who were vaccinated. Now check this out. There were 8 people who were exposed to the vaccine. There were 8 people who were exposed to these 2 patients. 8 healthcare workers, nurses. Now, normally, if you work at a hospital, everyone who does knows that you have to get your vaccine. So this was no different in the Netherlands. But there happened to be one healthcare worker who didn't get the vaccine. All right. So out of these 8, only one did not get the vaccine. The rest of them got it. Another one out of the 8, another one only got 1 shot. Okay. So one didn't get it, and one only got 1 dose of the measles vaccine. The rest, the 6, got 2 doses of the vaccine. Guess who got the measles? No, it was not the person, the healthcare worker who did not get the vaccine. And no, it was not the healthcare worker that only got 1 vaccine. It was the healthcare workers who got 2 doses of the MMR. 2 doses of the MMR. And so this article, if you were to read it, they're trying to figure out how in the world does someone who gets 2 doses of the vaccine become more likely to get measles than someone who doesn't get the shot and someone who only gets 1 dose of it. Again, think about it. Merck admits in 1992 that this vaccine may not, in fact, protect you from measles. And in 2014, this article shows that healthcare workers exposed to a patient who has measles. Think about it. Right now in New York, they probably have the hospitals on standby. They have everyone there. They have everyone there standing around. Oh man, another measles case is going to come in, and I'm sure they're all vaccinated. And yet, some of them, if they're receiving 2 to 3 doses of the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine, may be more likely to get measles than if a nurse or a doctor never got the shot. Think about that for a moment. Think about that. And we are declaring a state of emergency in New York over this. But again, Merck, true to advertising, also says the reason why the vaccine doesn't protect from the virus is for this next slide right here. This next slide right here, it says measles outbreak in a vaccinated school population. Now, I love this study. This was done in 1984. I think Merck had this in mind. They probably had read this study. And so in 1992, they're like, yeah, we better put at the bottom of our advertisement in small print that this vaccine may not protect everyone from the measles virus. Big paragraph first. Between March 3rd and April 18, 1984, an outbreak of measles occurred in a high school in Massachusetts with a documented school immunization level of 98%. Now let that sink into your heads. We're told that in some instances, herd immunity happens when you have 80% or 90%. These guys had 98% documented immunization level. And so what happens is what? They contracted the measles virus. Notice the researchers were excited because they got to test the vaccine against the virus, and the vaccine didn't do too hot. It says this setting allowed us to address the question whether measles transmission could be sustained in a highly vaccinated population to assess the role of vaccinated individuals in the transmission of the disease. They noticed that people who were allegedly protected from the virus got the virus. Sorry, they were protected from by the vaccine from the virus, actually ended up getting the virus. Notice what the small cutout says, the small portion of text, the small little paragraph. Notice what it says. This outbreak demonstrates that while measles transmission can occur in a highly vaccinated population and vaccine failures play some role in the spread of disease, such transmission is usually not sustained. Now, wait a second. Here they are covering for themselves. They're like, yeah, we have evidence that even if you're vaccinated, you'll still get the disease. And we have evidence that vaccines do fail, but it doesn't happen very often. I guess they didn't have the hindsight of knowing that 2014 article. And these aren't the only articles. There's actually more. I'm not sharing them all. I just wanted to share a few. I have one more to share with you on this very issue. Next slide. This is from the American Journal of Epidemiology, 1998. Now this is fascinating. I like this study. This study was very interesting to read because it touches on something quite important. And so this is a summation of what you would find in the study. All right, so I'm going to read it. Investigators probing the Finnish measles outbreak of 1988 to 1989 noted environmental conditions could facilitate vaccine failure, even in children receiving more than one dose of the MMR. Whoa. I thought that it didn't matter where you lived. I thought it didn't matter what you did as long as you had that shot, according to the mayor of New York, according to his health czar, as long as you have the shot, you're good. And here they are saying, well, that's not exactly the case. They're actually saying, and notice, that noted environmental conditions could facilitate vaccine failure, even children receiving more than one dose. So in other words, you could be in a place that is just so filthy and so contaminated that even if you think you're protected and have on paper that you've had the vaccine, it is of no use. Notice next sentence. Researchers determined in one particular region of Finland that improper ventilation was a culprit in massive vaccine failure. Ventilation. Where have we heard that before? What is it? Fresh air, sunlight, right? Exercise, nutrition, trusting in God, right? Have we usage of water? Have we not heard these things before? And here is a secular publication admitting, yeah, the vaccine can fail if you don't have proper air. But it goes on. It says defective ventilation allowed for a large amount of the virus to remain airborne, which defeated the immune system despite vaccination. The key to contracting the measles virus may have been due to the lack of fresh air and UV sunlight in the building. Now, look, if this is what they are saying can defeat the vaccine, why in the world should anyone be able to get on TV and threaten the individual liberties of conscientious parents over the fact that they don't receive the MMR? It's shown not to help healthcare workers who have received 2 doses. It's shown not to help children who are at school who received 2 doses. It didn't protect children in Finland who received 2 doses. Why in the world would we ever give up our liberties for this? Why in the world? It's because we're told that that should be the case. And this is a problem. We've lost our historical perspective. And there it is, black and white, our historical perspective. And I don't even have time. I would love to talk about the role of vitamin D, sunlight in your life, and building up the immunity. I'd love to talk about vitamin A, which you can get from the beta carotene, which is converted in the liver to vitamin A, which you get from carrots and other wonderful vegetables. I would love to talk about all of that and the things you can do to boost your immune system naturally. But I just want to show you the history here of the efficacy of vaccines and the threat, the real threat of the virus. It's blown up. Blown up because someone has a vested interest. Now this next slide is disturbing to me. This was a recent news event, and so let's go to the next slide. This is disturbing to me. All right. This was a recent story, and this was done in Arizona. And a friend of mine actually emailed me this today, and I saw it, and I watched some of the video, and it's terrifying. It says a SWAT team with guns drawn raids Arizona home for toddler with fever. Well, the reason why they raid this home with a toddler with fever is because this toddler did not have was unvaccinated. Was unvaccinated. This happened on March 28th, 2019. This was this year. So notice the police officer has his gun drawn and a light, and it's hard to tell, and the other police officer has a shield with his hand on a gun. And they kick open the door, someone's house, to grab a 2-year-old kid with its parents terrified because the child had a high fever and no vaccines. This is absurd. I mean, they came to your house. I mean, look, I don't know about you, but I know of plenty of people who are very red-blooded and very protective of their children. If someone kicks down their front door at night with guns drawn, they're going to be met with resistance. They're going to be met with other gunshots. How terrible would that have been if these police officers kick open this door and a father scared for his life starts shooting back? Over what, a high fever? A high fever and no vaccines? We just read in 1853, 1899, 1883, 1910, 1911, that measles wasn't even a threat and that they could manage high fevers with water. Now, maybe the police should have came and said, hey, we found that we were told by your doctor that your child has a high fever, and we're coming to make sure that your water's still working. Because if your water's working, you can do hydrotherapy on your kid and he'll be okay. So we just want to come, make sure that the water's on so your kid will be okay. That would have been nice. But they come there with guns blazing to take the kid away. To take the kid away because the doctor feared that there was going to be a terrible disease. Now, there's state representatives in Arizona, Representative Kelly Townsend. She reported on this, and this is the kicker of it. Townsend said that the child actually had an upper respiratory infection and not meningitis like the doctor feared. So the doctor was trained in medical school that the most dangerous thing that he has to worry about is not the drugs he prescribes, which in some journals show that over 200,000 people each year die from prescription drugs. That is more than car accidents. That is more than COPD. That is only third to cancer and heart disease. Over 200,000 people die every year from prescription drugs. In other words, the doctor's prescription pad was a greater threat to this child than the fever that he had. But he was trained in medical school that the most dangerous thing for a child is not to be vaccinated. The most dangerous thing for other children is an unvaccinated child. So what did he do? He gave this family the white glove treatment. And the white gloves came in behind a badge, blazing guns, and a shield. I would have been impressed with the doctor that he knew there was a crack operation going on or some illegal drug operation going on, and he sent these cops in there to risk their lives to save a child. But he doesn't do that. These cops go in there, guns a-blazing, to take a 2-year-old child with a high fever away from its parents because it hadn't been vaccinated, and the doctor was wrong. He was wrong. This is what happens. This is what it looks like when you give your rights away. This is what it looks like when you give your rights away. When doctors get to make decisions for you, when the state enforces those decisions on you, it is police officers at your door with guns. And nothing against the police officers. I'm sure that they were just doing their job. But notice they are carrying guns and they're pointing them. You got to ask yourself, why are they pointing the guns? Because they don't know what's behind that door. They were told a kid is in danger and they got to go rescue the kid. And you know that if they're not familiar with this or experienced with this, they're nervous. Could you imagine in the heat of the moment that maybe a picture fell off the wall or something fell down after that door came off the hinges and it sounded like gunfire? They would have lit that entire house up with bullets. Could you imagine the terrible tragedy it would have been that a father would have been shot to death in front of his child for not having it vaccinated because the doctor thought it had a serious disease? Could you imagine that? This is why we should never let it come to this. This is why we who believe in religious freedom should stand firm that religious freedom does not just merely apply to me reading the Bible on the Sabbath day or any day. It also applies to my body, the integrity of my body as well. Because just as Daniel and his friends withstood Nebuchadnezzar and said, I'm not going to put into my body something that I believe is harmful according to my faith in God, everyone deserves that right and that ability if you believe in religious freedom. If you don't, then I have no argument for you. And this is why I conclude with the last slide. This is the last one.
Before you go there, Dr. Tim.
Yes, sir.
Can a person use the information that you presented in this presentation to share with his or her healthcare provider for his or her child to justify why he or she will not vaccinate his or her child? If so, what do you think the response would be?
Well, so we don't know who that doctor was in the previous slide, the doctor in Arizona. We don't know who he was. He might have been, for all intents and purposes, the child's pediatrician. And you see how well that went. I think you should talk to your doctor, but I also think you should talk to your legislator. See, this is the part of the problem sometimes with us religious people, is that we don't get involved in our local civic organizations. We don't get involved. We don't let them know that we exist. We don't talk to them. We don't do anything. And I know there's a big issue with politics and all that, but here's the thing. These people are in your community. They should know who you are. As a matter of fact, if you are serving that community as a Christian, they should know who you are before you even introduce yourself. They say, yeah, I know who you are. You're the guy who hands out Bibles to the homeless people. I know you are. You're the guy who goes down to the prison and prays with the prisoners. I know who you are. You're the guy whose kids I never see running around the store and knocking things off the wall. I know who you are. You're the guy who has that ministry and have come and prayed with people in the hospital. In other words, civic leaders and try to evangelize people. We have a message, not just for the very poor, not just for the very rich, not for the black, not for the white, not for the Asian, not for the Hispanic. We have a message for everyone. And I honestly think that you should reach out to your doctor, but you should also reach out to your legislature. You should also reach out to your county commissioner. You should also reach out to the people on your local school board. You should also join a homeschooling group if you choose to homeschool your kids. If you send your kids to, in other words, hiding in our cave, waiting for the wrath to pass, it's just simply not going to work. You need to be out there. You need to be out there. This is part of evangelism as well.
Correct.
This is part of evangelism, is that being out there brings visibility and brings the gospel to people who otherwise wouldn't have come in contact with it. And sometimes I get sad. I look online and what I see is people arguing among themselves. You know, there's a famous story that when the Saracens were conquering Constantinople, they were besieging Constantinople in 1453, that the brain trusts, the religious leaders, were gathered around debating, and this is a legend, debating the color of the scepter that the angels were carrying. You see, had they been doing their work of evangelism, had they been working and doing what they were supposed to do, it might not have gone down like that for them. It might not have gone down, and even if it did, many lives would have been saved.
Now, Doc, some questions are coming in here. And before you get to your last slide, on that point of evangelism, number one, then based on what we have heard so far this evening, there's much work for us to do then.
Much.
And number two, why is it that the combating of measles with hydrotherapy, as far as we know, stalled or came to an end in the early 1900s? Why is it that we don't have Seventh-day Adventist institutions that are now promoting hydrotherapy to combat various diseases? So as the world is looking to stripping away our rights and forcing vaccines upon the masses, we could have been a city upon a hill saying we have the historical, we have the empirical data, we have the witnesses, the testimonies, the scientific facts that show this is the best way, not the better way, the best way. Why is it?
Right. Well, you know, it's a number of factors that all happened at the same time. One, it was the growth of the pharmaceutical industry. What's fascinating is that Edward Plater, Simon Baruch, there's some others physicians who Guy Hinsdale, even our Harvey Kellogg. These guys were mainstream medicine, and you can look in the old journals of the American Medical Association where they recommend hydrotherapy. An interesting study is to actually get old Merck manuals. So Merck manuals were basically telling you what to use to treat certain diseases. And what you'll be shocked in is that sometimes the Merck manual would recommend certain herbs before drugs were there. What had happened is there was a systematic expunging of natural remedies and leaning more towards drug medication. The problem with us is that while we were leaders in hydrotherapy and published many books and trained nurses and did all this, as the medical establishment moved towards drugs, we uncritically moved with them. Whatever they said, we did. If they said jump, we said how high. And now today, our medicine is almost indistinguishable from the world. Indistinguishable from the world. We have bought onto this paradigm to a point that now the world is crying out for what we had to give it, and now we don't even know how to do it. There's a famous, I shouldn't say famous, but there was an article in the Review and Herald in 1918. It was 1918 during the Great Swine Flu epidemic. And this writer, he writes in a letter, and he talks to the editor of the Review at that time, and he says, you know what? He says, the swine flu, the Great Swine Flu is killing a lot of people, but because we're trained in hydrotherapy, we've been able to save a lot of people. He says that doctors, this writer said that doctors were coming to him to learn how to do hydrotherapy. He said that people were coming to the Seventh-day Adventist Church wanting to learn how to do hydrotherapy because it was the only thing that was effective in the 1918 swine flu epidemic. In other words, they became a city set on the hill not because they spoke and acted like the world, is because they stood and they were contradistinctive or distinguished from it. And the only way we'll ever be able to do this is if we get back and make the trumpet have a distinctive sound. And to do that, I hate to say it, but we're going to have to go back and reinvent some of these things that we have lost. I think a lot of ministries are trying to do it, and I think more organization needs to be done because there is a scientific basis for it. I mean, look, right now, Advent Health advertises on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers Stadium or their practice facility in One Buck Place. And Advent Health is the former Florida hospital, is the system in Florida that Adventists run that practices, mainstream medicine. In One Buck Place, the very facility that bears the Advent Health logo, you know what they do to the football players to keep them on the field? They use hydrotherapy. They have hydrotherapy tanks. They use heat. They use electricity. They use exercise. They use all this to keep men whose jobs it is to stay on the field and avoid surgery and to reduce pain. They do all of this. And it bears our name. And so you ask yourself, why couldn't we just do what they do for the athletes? It's a strange coincidence, so to speak.
Okay, Doc. Let me have you get to your slide to close off.
Right.
I have a few more questions for you, and then we'll close. Go ahead.
So here's the last slide, and I think this is where we need to think. This is where we need to put our minds. And this was a quote from a judge from the Brooklyn Daily Eagle in 1898, and his quote rings true back then as it does today. Under the English and American law, man should not be compelled by force to submit to vaccination any more than to swallow a dose. There was more to be feared from the exercise of arbitrary power than from all of the contagious diseases combined. Now, I just want to leave you with this thought. There was the plague in the Dark Ages. There was the plague in the Dark Ages. What did people fear more than the plague? They feared the Inquisition. There was diseases in Nazi Germany. What did people fear more than Nazi Germany? What did they fear more than Hitler's tanks? His concentration camps. There's diseases in the Soviet Union under Stalin. There were plenty of diseases there. You know what people feared more than that? Was the gulags, being put in work camps and disappeared. We should always be on guard for the exercise of our arbitrary power. That means your rights being thrown away, even if someone's telling us it's in our best interest. Remember, they don't come to you and say, I'm doing this to hurt you. They come to you and say, I'm doing this to help. I'm sure those policemen who went to that door were told, you need to save this kid's life. I'm sure that doctor, when he made that call to police, he justified his actions by saying, I'm saving a life. Sometimes people can be quite brutal when they're saying they're helping you. And we need to always remember that. Even with Daniel and his friends, right? They didn't choose that diet to punish them. They chose that diet because it was the conventional wisdom of the time. And so, as people who have a last day message, we need to make the trumpet have a distinctive sound. And that sound is religious freedom, medical freedom, and liberty to the very end of conscience. That's what we need to stand for.
No, I believe the Lord did not disappoint us this evening during your presentation, and I praise God.
Amen.
And I praise God for you. Think about this question. As I sat here and I listened and I watched and I took heed, here's one point I would like your feedback on. If measles rarely lead to mortality, yet New York City has implemented these harsh, rogue measures, what would the government do if a disease and a virus hit that frequently leads to mortality?
Do you remember back when there was the Ebola scare? And there was the Ebola scare, and so what was amazing is that countries in Africa were closing the borders. These were countries that were right next to each other, and they closed the borders and they wouldn't let people come in where Ebola was endemic. They wouldn't do it. And then there was a stink that a guy came back from one of those countries and was able to land in the United States, and we didn't quarantine him. We didn't do anything. And it's a very strange thing that the government wants to throw the book at you over measles, but then wants to allow Ebola into the nation. And then when you try to have a discussion about it, they're like, no, we're not going to talk about it. Listen, I don't know what goes on in the halls of government, but what I can tell you is that it certainly doesn't make sense unless there's some sort of nefarious ulterior motive.
Correct.
I think that if, God forbid, if a disease ever broke out that was quite terrible, it would be blamed on those people who are distinct, those people who do not go along with the system, and they would be the first to be rounded up. I think that if you know this, the admonitions towards country living are quite pertinent to this conversation.
Yes. Lastly, because I have more questions are coming in. But as I sat here and listened, my mind went back to the statement in Testimonies for the Church, Volume 7, page 62, where Sister White says, we have come to a time wherein every member of the church should take hold of the medical missionary work, that there will be a Lazarus house, victims of both physical and spiritual disease, not only those of our own faith, but largely from those in the world. And as you mentioned, 2 therapies that were used to check measles. Number 1, a wet sheet wrap. A wet sheet wrap, a cold wet sheet wrap, as well as enemas.
Yep.
You know, how important would books such as Ministry of Healing and Healthful Living be for the world even at this time?
Very important. I think it's important. I also think that there needs to be a greater partnership with ministries that want to do this and physicians and people in the area who are into it, so that people can have practical demonstrations, so they can hear about the different issues that would afflict them. And information is going to be key, but there needs to be there again. I'm trying to join with other like-minded physicians who believe in natural remedies and believe in the Word of God. And I think we need to get together and say, hey, how can we assist our brethren in the independent ministries who are going door to door, to be a resource to them, to help them, to move these cases along, to help them determine what case is serious and what case is not. Sometimes the biggest fear in treating anyone is knowing when you can treat and knowing when your treatments are having no effect. Again, hydrotherapy doesn't work all the time, but certainly it works more often than not. And sometimes people are too far gone, so you have to have some experience, but that's all been lost. You know, when the College of Medical Evangelists, before it was called Loma Linda, existed, they would train physicians and they would train nurses all to work there, but then they would also train evangelists and lay people in some of these simple remedies. And it was nice that that these evangelists and lay people could always refer back to these doctors in the school to say, hey, I had a tough case. What do you think I should do? But we don't even have that. That network has been dissolved. Now, if you go to your physician and say, hey, by the way, my kid had a fever and I wrapped some wet sheets around his chest, he might have, Child Protective Services or Department of Children and Family on speed dial.
Yes.
It's insane.
Yes. You know, as I see this crisis, it's a wake-up call for God's people.
It is.
To be about aggressive evangelism. Not only, just think about the fact that in this crisis, God would have opened the door and we could have gone into New York City.
Yes.
And promote and publicize and advertise and hold meetings where we could lecture on these points and
Yes.
have practical demonstrations and teach people the principles laid out in Selected Messages Book 2, page 291, which says an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, connected with prayer. I mean, now, we would be persecuted if God does not protect us. But again, without controversy, great is the mystery of godliness. So
Yes.
we have to look at these crises as calling from God to be about his business. What do you say?
I agree.
Last words.
I think, you know, I've been spending some time in Fox Book of Martyrs, and I was listening to a story about Thomas Cranmer, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury, and he took the Reformation so seriously. He would be the intellectual giant behind the Reformation in England under Edward VI, and he was martyred by Mary, who was Philip II's husband, known as Bloody Mary. So anyways, it's said that during the time of the Reformation, knowing how serious it was, he would go to bed around 9 and wake up at 2 a.m. and he would study his Bible from 2 a.m. till about 9 a.m. That's how serious the Reformation was for them. And any of the great reformers, they were prolific in writing, prolific in studying. And the reason why they did that is not because they said, man, you know, I don't like sleep and I don't have things to do. They all had things to do. But the Reformation was everything to them. This doctrine, this truth was everything to them. Yes. And the other reason why, not only they love it, but they knew there was a sword, there was a stake with a burning fire, there was a spy, there was someone waiting to persecute them and shut them down. And they said, man, if Satan's agents are going to work hard, I'm going to work hard in the service of the Lord. If the Lord gave everything to me, I'm going to give everything to him. And it was the extremity of the situation that caused them to manifest such heroic actions. And I think when we're in a time as we are now, we have to ask ourselves, do we really believe this? Because if we really believe this, why aren't we fighting harder? Why isn't our voice going further? Why aren't we doing these things? And I know many of us feel like we're doing enough. Well, guess what? When the cops kick open your door,
yes,
you're gonna and they go to take your child, all your arguments are over with at that point. You're not going to argue with a Glock 19. You're not going to argue with a shield, and you're not going to argue with, special forces police officers. It's not going to happen. You need to do it now while you can. I think there's a quote that says, what was our privilege to do in a time of ease, we will have to do in a time of extremity.
Volume 5, page 463.
Yes.
The work
and I feel,
which the church has failed to do in a time of peace and prosperity, she will have to do in a terrible crisis, under the most discouraging and forbidding circumstances.
Yes. And I think we're getting there. I think we're seeing these drops slowly fall. And we need to be awake. It's a very strange situation we're in, and I hope it does wake us up.
All right. Again, I want to thank the Lord for Dr. Tim Perenich this evening for sharing with us. And what was your title, preacher?
It was
Measles.
It was Measles Mania in Context.
And by God's grace, we will have you back to share with us. Again, friends, we praise the Lord. At this time, let's bow our heads for a word of prayer at this time. Father in heaven, to you belong all glory, honor, and praise. We thank you. And to whom much is given, much is required. Bless our hands and our feet, that we may have busy hands and active brains for your cause, your business. Keep us faithful. And those who will receive this material, let them use it wisely, and not go to extremes, that souls may be awakened, be saved, We thank you for hearing us. We thank you for answering. Save us is our prayer. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen.
Amen. Thank you.